The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this pre-Christmas break webinar from the International Society of Chief Data Officers. It's the next one in our series of supporting what Chief Data Officers and data leaders do. And this one looks at 3 steps to a safe data strategy. Our presenter today, we're very fortunate to have him, is Luk Arbuckle from Privacy Analytics, one of the sponsors of the society. Now, Luk is one of the leaders, the thought leaders in this particular field, and has a very strong background, having worked previously with the Privacy Commissioner of Canada as the Director of Technology and Analysis. And he also, in addition to having his role with Privacy Analytics, has a global role working with regulators across the globe, looking at anonymization and working with these global organizations on standards for how data could be used, taking account of the requirements of data privacy. I know that I'm very much looking forward to what Luk has to say here, and will doubtless be scribbling notes furiously from what he has to say. I hope you all get as much from it as we're expecting you to. So, Robert, if I hand back to you, then we can just get on with the presentation from Luk.
We're making Luk the presenter. So, Luk, you should see a screen coming up.
Yes, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Robert. Let me just go in full screen mode. All right, there we go. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to ISTDO for having us here today. I want to thank everyone, of course, for joining us on our presentation on creating a safe data strategy. Now, I want to do something a little different, something I haven't done in a presentation before, and ask everyone to imagine that you have a set of goals and objectives you're trying to achieve. Say it's part of a data strategy, either an official one that's been developed and is being deployed, or something unofficial, just a set of objectives that fit within the concept of a data strategy. And the key piece here is that you're trying to leverage data assets that include sensitive data. So the problem you're having is that you can't get people to agree on a way forward. You've got people worried about the uses of that sensitive data. There is confusion on what it is you're trying to achieve in your strategy. And there may even be a lack of digital literacy that is preventing people from actually understanding a lot of the concepts and things you're trying to roll out in this data strategy. So the need ultimately is an alignment. You need alignment in order to get people to actually execute on that strategy. So today what we're going to look at is a fundamental approach to create a data strategy. It makes effective use of your data assets, including sensitive information. The key insight is that we want to get organizational license to use data. We want buy-in. We want people to agree to champion a data strategy. And for that, we're going to need to strategically use trust to align and execute. What we're going to be presenting is a focused, actionable approach that we've used with our clients and can be completed in less than a month if you have an engaged team of stakeholders that can help you move your strategy forward. So what you're going to learn in this presentation is what we mean by safe data, what a safe data strategy is, and those core steps for developing an actionable strategy. Obviously, the purpose of a data strategy is to make effective use of data assets, and of course, it's to achieve those organizational objectives that you have assigned to you. Trust is needed to align those key stakeholders to drive execution, and it's at the heart of what we mean by the safe data and safe strategy in the context of leveraging sensitive information. So in order to tell this story, rather than give you just the strategy that we use, we're actually going to drive it through a client story. We'll tell you a client use case and how this worked out for them. But before we get into that, tell you a little bit more about some introductions about myself, Privacy Analytics, and what we've noticed as a company. So first, our experience as a company, Privacy Analytics has been in the business of data privacy since around 2007, so nearly 14 years. And we've worked with over 180 clients, helping them meet a variety of regulatory needs across many jurisdictions, making them CCPA, HIPAA, and GDPR ready. We have over 100 in-house experts that have assessed thousands of data sets for all kinds of different technology stacks in a variety of different industries. We're recognized as technology analysts and clients as pioneers in development of systems and methods to evaluate the responsible use of data, as well as providing software and services to enable our clients to responsibly use sensitive data assets. A little bit more about me. You heard a little bit about me from Mike at the beginning. Just give you a little bit more because obviously the title itself is quite unique. The term methodologist is used by national statistical organizations to mean the science behind how we evaluate the system and methods to create safe data, what we're calling safe data. Ultimately, part of my role is to ensure that the methods that we use across the organization are consistent as well, right? We have a methodology for evaluating our system and methods for creating safe data and responsible uses of data, but also we have to ensure that we're using them across the organization through those different business lines. So you've already heard I have a background, a bit of a regulatory background, written a couple of books, member of ISO standardization committees, working on a variety of standards there as well. So enough about me, that's not what you're here for. So let's talk a little bit about some of the key questions we've heard from clients, the challenges that they're facing. So first, how do we get people comfortable with sharing and reusing data more broadly across the organization? How do we get data owners to accept the governance and controls we have in place? Is our process compliant? How should we design it differently? We want to collect or pool data from multiple sources. And we want to use that data in ways that were not originally anticipated. Can we design a system to do this? How do we educate and align internal teams given low data literacy? What are the options to deal with a data over retention issue? What is allowed or not allowed, and what do we need to consider through the entire data lifecycle? So as I said, these are questions that are brought to us by clients and the variety of interactions we have with them. The question is really, how do these compare to your experience? Questions you've been asking yourself, questions you think need answered. So let's take a step back, because that was probably a lot of information, and kind of look at some key themes here. So we have some of the key words: comfortable, compliant, accept, anticipate, educate and align, options, and what's allowed. So we're starting to see a theme that emerges from this. What we find is there's typically three main things that clients want, right? We're talking about a data strategy, so naturally the first thing they want is data. They need this for decision making, to innovate, or to improve services in some way. They want to collect or access relevant data, but they also want to maintain that collection or access. Second is they want alignment, right? They have several stakeholders involved. They have business units, they have system owners and operators, they have senior leadership as well. They need to get alignment across these different functions within an organization, and they need to maintain that alignment. And also, they need, obviously they're looking for execution. Once you have alignment, then you can have successful execution in terms of driving the strategy forward, right? They want an actionable strategy that is needed so that they can drive those successes forward in terms of those organizational objectives. So some of the challenges that these organizations face in our experience, for one, is that, obviously they're busy. They tend to be very tactical, right? They're dealing with the issues at hand. It's a lot easier just to, pick up a problem that you're getting and trying to address it right away. The problem with this, of course, is that you can end up patching holes in a leaky ship. Second is that oftentimes the strategic needs are really unknown because you're dealing with those tactical issues because you're busy, you've got a lot on your plate. What is the compelling data strategy? How are you going to get all those stakeholders aligned across the different business functions that we discussed? Ultimately, what you want is to develop stewards. You want alignment across those different business functions. And, I'll give you a Latin proverb: if there's no wind, row. So we need people to row the boat, right? Remember that leaky ship? We need to get champions for our data strategy. And then third is there's often an uncertainty on how to move forward. How do we actually get a strategy, get people aligned, get them to enact our strategy? So we want to get consensus around the right strategy, and otherwise we just end up with a ship that's going nowhere. So let's look at a process that was really going to make this strategy real for those variety of stakeholders. We're going to show you what's required to leverage safe data so that you can create and maintain alignment to execute. That's the ultimate goal of this presentation. So based on our experience, there are really three core elements plus execution. So we'll call this a 3+1 strategy. And it's how the presentation is organized. So this is actually the agenda for today, so to speak. And again, we're going to drive this using a client story. So first, we have a strategy that incorporates trust. This is basically our vision statement. Second, we're going to have alignment on core objectives for safe data. We want teams to see the vision realized. We want them to actually help us, right? They have to be able to be part of this process. Third is a framework for principles of trusted systems. So we're going to define the rules of actions needed to build trustworthy systems. And the plus one is the execution on the safe data strategy. We're moving out of strategy into roadmaps. Now, the approach is to prepare and support leaders and give them clear direction on the way forward, right? Whether you're at the strategic level already, or you're dealing with the range of tactical ideas because things are coming at you very fast, the point here is to support and move this forward. Now, we only have time to scratch the surface. There's actually a lot that I could say about this, but hopefully we'll capture those key elements. And ultimately what we hope is that you can see, even from this perspective already, start to see how this may fit with your current objectives or your initiatives in general. So let's start with the first of the three core steps, the role of trust in our data strategy. This is a big picture view of what we aim to achieve, right? As I said, this is our vision. So the client story is, we're going to call them Acme Analytics, a large multinational. There was a leader that came to us, wanted to take a step back and consolidate many of the different efforts that they had underway. And of course, there was a lot of discussion, figuring out the way forward. And big part of this presentation is showing you how those conversations came together. Now, Acme Analytics, as I said, they're a large multinational. There's competing business lines, different ways of thinking because they're in different jurisdictions. They have different needs, different ways of collecting data, different pipelines, different type of data they're collecting as well. And so, of course, there's a lot of different ways of doing things, and that's why taking a step back in this way and looking at it from a strategic perspective can actually be very challenging. So Acme Analytics they could develop their own data strategy. They knew what they were doing. They, in fact, already had data strategies in place for those different business lines. And we're pretty much assuming that you're equipped to do this. You have probably your own definitions of a data strategy. So what we'll look at is some of the core elements of what we mean by a data strategy, just to make sure we're all talking the same language. So value, the job to be done for the envisioned future. This is how you're going to derive value from data, right? As I said, Acme has established business lines already, so they already have this in place. They know how they can derive value from data. And that comes from insights, the serious analysis turned into understanding. It's the vision, or the vision itself is insight driven, right? There's an experience. They've been exploring these different business lines, been in the space for a while. They're experimenting with new things. They have a good idea of the insights that are driving the value in terms of how they use data. Principles, the way in which actions will be driven. So this is the how of an insight-driven value proposition. Acme is already aligned with organizational value, at least conceptually, and that's where we're going to look at where the challenges lie. And then, of course, the goals are the long-term results you're aiming to achieve. So the business lines need to line up to these organizational ones, of course. And this is a big part of the conversation as well. Or, taking, for example, Acme, looking at their organizational goals and how they align to those long-term results. So right now, you'd think, if you have this strategy in place, even if it's for different business lines, or if you want to take a step back and make sure that everything's, at a broader level, perhaps, you'd feel pretty good, right? And Acme felt pretty good about their data strategy within those different business lines. But the challenge they were facing was that they were working with sensitive data. And so there were a lot of concerns in terms of, from the stakeholders, raising questions about how this was happening. And there was some uncertainty around some of the platforms that were being developed and if they should use them or shouldn't. And so what they ultimately found was that another layer was needed to support their team to drive the strategy forward. And so what we're going to do is we're going to really focus in on the last two core steps, the principles and the goals. So the data strategy is how you achieve your goals through those measurable actions, right? It's the blueprint to our future state. Questions from our clients, and in particular Acme Analytics, we saw earlier included things like compliance, the comfort of data owners regarding the controls in place if they're going to use a platform, for example, education on aligning their teams, and you may even have heard these yourself. So the principles of your data strategy, the question is, are they getting you to your goals? They might get you your goals to some extent, but maybe you're seeing resistance, you're getting pushback, or maybe people are even ignoring some of what you're trying to achieve. And what the Acme Analytics leadership wanted to do is they wanted to craft a vision that would be supported by others, get everyone aligned to execute. The key ingredient here that was needed was trust, right? And yes, I recognize that this is a broad and loaded term, but ask yourself just in general, how trust played a role in any initiatives you're familiar with. Did a lack of trust potentially hold that initiative back, right? when you think about it, trust is at the heart of any change management exercise. So it wouldn't be surprising to kind of, when you reflect on it, you realize, yeah, okay, there was an issue of trust, or trust between different stakeholders, trust in what they were trying to achieve, trust in how it, benefited that stakeholder, for example. So that we're going to get at really at the core of our challenge that we're describing has to do with what we call trusted systems design, and we'll explain that a little bit more later on. But it's meant to address the issues of compliance, comfort of data owners, and education. And this is what Acme Analytics recognized they needed to do. They need to bring trust to the processes and technology that they were employing. Okay, so what do we mean by safe data? We could think of this purely from a compliance perspective and talk about, the people and the settings in which the data is being used, the threat landscape, right? Very important concept. And of course, the outputs that are being derived from the data, ensuring all that is safe. But it's not just about compliance. That's sort of one of the core messages I want to get across here. We want to look at data and processing that is safe, meaning that the organization is comfortable with that data. And by organization, I mean all those stakeholders that are going to be involved, right? There's always more that we can be done. The question is what is needed and how it's going to be captured and how it's going to impact the future processing goals. So at Privacy Analytics, we often, as I said, we have clients asking us about this, and we're trying to help them understand the compliance and expectations in terms of safe data. But again, it's not just about our perspective. It's not just about external perspective. It's also about the organization feeling comfort and trusting the frameworks and the tools that are going to be used.
Hey, Luke, sorry, can I just do a quick introduction? Sorry, not a quick introduction, quick interruption. I just want to double check. Mike, you are hearing Luke, right? Mike, can you hear?
Yeah, loud as bells. Take 5.
Great. There's just a couple of comments that one or two people can't hear them. So it does seem to be that it's an issue on your end, not on the recording end. So look, sorry to interrupt. I know this is being recorded, so I will ask anyone that runs into audio issues to check their audio on their side. Sorry for the interruption. Luke, go ahead and continue.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. It's really important. I'm always terrified at the beginning of a presentation that people can't hear me, especially in a virtual environment. How many times have we been in meetings where you forget to unmute?
That's right. Yeah, appreciate that. No, but you're coming through loud and clear. Thanks, Luke.
Okay, perfect. So I think I was done with this slide anyway. Ultimately, one of the things I just wanted to point out is in the case of Acme Analytics, which we'll see more of in detail in a few slides later on, part of this is capturing the culture and their views, right? What are their perspectives on, what they consider safe? How do we put this in a framework that they will understand and they will accept, right? We have to wrap a bow around this so that we can move forward with our data strategy. So Acme Analytics needed to explore what safe data meant to them, right? What activities they needed now in the future based on their future processing goals, right? There's certain objectives and certain goals that they're trying to achieve. Now, when I say activities, I should probably explain, I mean by that things like governance, technologies, processing to make data safe in that operational context, right? These need to be driven by actionable insights, of course, and derived from real evidence, because that's going to become the narrative for the data strategy. Now, how we prioritize these activities is part of our strategy. It includes, for example, very important, the organizational objectives, right? Safe data is not just safe for the sake of compliance. We have to align to those organizational goals, whether they be efficiency and innovation, competitive pressures, or say justification for processing sensitive data even. This is how we drive value with sensitive data. I mean, ultimately the goal is that strategy needs to be transformative, right? We're looking to the future. So at the root of those business objectives is also generating sustainable value from this data. We want trustworthy systems that are adaptable to future needs. Now, obviously, an underlying theme here is that we're talking about data-driven value. We're talking about data strategy. We're talking about insights, driving insights from data. So, data-driven value is a core of this. But we need teams that are aligned on that safe data strategy in order to execute. Okay, so Acme Analytics accepted a vision to inspire a data strategy, specifically using the role of trust to be part of that framework. And then once that was agreed upon, we could start looking at organizational goals and making sure that objectives were going to be met by pushing this forward, right? Because we're not trying to hamper innovation, we're not trying to get in the way, we're actually trying to enable. It's quite the opposite. And this is actually a very effective approach in getting alignment with senior leadership. Carrie Snee, Senior Manager of Capability and Control at Instinctive BI, says, it's critical to get executive buy-in, This structured approach helped shape the art of the possible and has allowed the business to make better and more informed strategic decisions. So now on to the second of our 3 steps to develop a safe data strategy. We want alignment on our goals, right? We want to ensure that those organizational objectives are being met. And of course, we need a team that needs to want to see this vision realized, right? So the concept of safe data may seem very straightforward, but this is only the summit, only the tip of a very large pyramid with many foundational layers, and that's what we're going to look at now. What we mean for data to be safe, there's a lot of supporting things we need to put in place, right? Again, we're trying to achieve alignment across a variety of teams and possibly up and down a management hierarchy as well, depending where you fit within an organization. And this actually is this part of the presentation is going to really show the knowledge required to create a safe data strategy. We want a team that is informed to help make this strategy real. And ultimately, think for yourself. What do you think you would need? What decision makers or stakeholders do you need at the table to make this successful? So we've talked about safe data, and as I said, it's just the very tip of a foundational work that has already been completed. In many cases, organizations already have this, either explicitly or implicitly, and we'll walk through these. Our job as leaders, though, is to really help everyone see the work coming together to create a data strategy that people will support, right? Acme Analytics, we went through a series of interviews to talk with different stakeholders, get their perspectives, understand some of the insights that they've gained, understand their views, ultimately, these different groups. And then we want to pull this all together in terms of what has been achieved already, but also what more is needed, right? How do we ensure that everyone has trust in the system? We want to build a way forward, right? So what we're doing is we're providing strategic perspective. We know where this is headed. Obviously, we're at the tip here. We're getting to the point of safe data. But how do we make this concept, move this into actionable steps, and how do we actually get those foundational pieces in place? So first, we'll start with the organizational goals. We have to put safe data in the context of those goals, right? Again, we're not doing this just for the sake of compliance. We have to meet certain objectives. So at Acme Analytics, they were already starting to look at distilling policies for managing sensitive data. We asked about organizational results frameworks, if they had any of these in place, what cultural views were or ways of doing things, because these are going to be very important to get people behind a strategy and helping move and row the boat, and whether or not they were open to a new framework model. And in fact, what we ended up doing was doing exactly that. We introduced a model because they had many pieces, but they didn't have one that rolled it all together, and we produced a framework that they could use to help align on certain aspects. But the goal here is that you want anything that will help align on organizational goals, right? You want to anchor it on familiar things that people already have confidence in. It's already something that has helped the organization achieve its current status. For Acme, really critical to align on safe data with those organizational objectives. As I said, it's not just for the sake of compliance. We're going beyond compliance here. They need to meet certain efficiency gains or innovate from the data. So there is a respect for the overall vision, right, of processing and using data the organization is comfortable with to get value from sensitive data. So next, we can look at the design of a system. So this has its own set of principles needed to align conceptually on basically what those things are, and we will talk a bit more about that. So Acme had policies and procedures in place that provided direction. Some of the challenges are demonstrating the intentions of being trustworthy, right? We may have the policies in place, but how do we demonstrate they're being followed, right? Is everyone reading the policies? Are they following them correctly? How do we know that they're actually acting on them? How do we monitor what they're doing and how they're doing it? And this is where technology enabled governance comes into play. So stakeholders understand the policies and procedures, but they'll understand they're enforced if you have technology behind them that's supporting them in some way. So this is how we're going to earn trust of many of the stakeholders. In the case of Acme Analytics, they actually had a platform they wanted more of the business units to use and to become more efficient and gain more insights, et cetera. But this is where some of the challenges lie, that they needed to understand what the technology was and how it was going to support them, and ensuring that it actually had their needs for their particular jurisdiction or in their particular data and collection of data. Ultimately, what we want to do is provide evidence that everything is operating as intended through technology. So we want to translate the goals and objectives into design requirements, and this is its own topic, and I'll touch a little bit on it in the next couple sections. But it's ultimately what our goal is we want to speak in the language of designers. We want to get them behind this as well to help us really pull it all together. So this is going to be the third core step that we're going to talk about in terms of our data strategy, the idea of taking policies and moving them into functional design elements. So Acme, translating the policy and procedures, realized that this requires a lot of interpretation, of course, and they had people that did this, you know, on project basis, but they were trying to take a step back. Of course, with this sort of framework, you're going to have a lot of criteria, a lot of different options to consider. Oftentimes that can be too much, right? It's too much of a good thing. You've got a lot of criteria, a lot of options. People don't know which ones to select. Are they being selected for regulatory reasons, for trust reasons, in the sense of, you know, maybe the operators not feeling comfortable what's there? What are the reasons behind it, right? So what approaches have you seen work well in practice? There's no right or wrong answer, but it's worth getting perspectives from various stakeholders, because ultimately it's their experience that's going to drive the direction you take in terms of this safe data strategy. So just to be clear, you know, risk-based compliance is fairly well known, but the idea here is that we want to prioritize the controls that we're looking at, the technology and the governance, based on evaluation of risk, right? We're trying to replace the subjective with a more guided decision-making process. Now, you'll notice here this on this sort of subtext here, it says guardrails to guide selection of options. The idea here is to stay on the road, right? If you have a bunch of options, people may go, you know, really far one way or really far the other, and you want to make sure they don't go too far either way. They want to stay on the road, right, of what is considered acceptable within the organization's risk appetite. Now, I mean, ultimately, you have to ask yourself: does everyone in your organization, can they make decisions about, you know, all of these options in terms of a risk-based way? Are they familiar with this, or do they need guidance? Right, that's ultimately the thinker, and that's what we mean by those guardrails, to make sure they stay on the road. And the last foundational layer, again, Acme recognized they needed to go up the hierarchy. There's certain things in that risk-based compliance they were thinking, that's not our decision to make, right? We don't want to go too far in one direction and completely block people from accessing relevant data for their needs, as long as it's, you know, the right checks and balances are in place. So they didn't feel that was their responsibility or other data users' responsibility. It had to come down from higher up, right? Higher up the organization. So these are the kind of things that are non-negotiable, basically. They're going to be probably across all functions. They could be defined by certain types of data, certain data processes as well. But the goal, the point here is that it's going to come from higher up, right? Someone has to decide on the organization's risk appetite, right? These are the minimum conditions, the constraints that are going to be put in place. You can think of, again, in terms of guardrails, but more akin to train tracks, right? These are the things that, you know, we're staying on the right path unless something is seriously wrong, okay? And this is ultimately heart of design, right? We just talked about both criteria and constraints at a strategic level for the organization, but it feeds into what we mean by trustworthy systems design. We're getting closer to the specifics of design and implementation, but that's actually going into roadmaps, and we're not going to get into that today. We're not going to have time, quite frankly. But it's important that the team understands these basic concepts so that we can really get them behind and working with us on the strategic plan to mobilize towards execution. Now, Acme Analytics, very informed, they already knew who they needed at the table. They also recognized they needed evidence of those different pieces of that strategy pyramid, right? They needed to inform alignment and execution of objectives. So they knew the kind of people they needed from that, both internal, external, and in terms of experience with regulators, for example. They needed people that knew what works in practice and what doesn't, quite frankly. So there's a certain depth of knowledge and expertise that is needed to pull this together. And now I'm really referring to the stakeholders that we need to bring together to see the vision of that data leader realized. We want to align on our organizational goals, but at the same time, we have to make sure those core objectives are met. So who is that engaged team? So in our experience and with Acme Analytics, there was three sort of core stakeholder groups that were identified. So we needed involvement of these people. So we have data governance, business units, and IT. So it was their practical knowledge that would provide the insights needed to drive this strategy forward, right? Need to get this group together, again, using things that they're familiar with, organizational culture and frameworks they're already familiar with, get everyone to agree on an approach taken and building in the principles of maintaining trust, okay? So in terms of data governance, we obviously want to get design outcomes that are aligned with our principles of trust. The data use and reuse, well, we need full functionality, right? Ultimately, there are still business objectives that have to be met, so they have to be aligned as well. They have to be part of the conversation. Otherwise, it's just compliance for the sake of compliance. And ultimately, most likely, you're going to need information technology because they're part of the conversation in terms of the governance and the controls in place and the technology. So design of technology to enable those policy choices, right? Now, in the case of Acme, because they had multiple business lines, and this was a very high-level strategy that was being developed, they decided to start with one business line. So in terms of the data use reuse group, there was one business line that was selected to start the process. And they were going to go from one business line to the next to test it out and figure out, well, in terms of risk-based compliance, where those sort of boundaries were based on the experience of these different groups. But the key idea here is that we're working together to align on those strategic goals. So do you have experience working with these different stakeholder groups, right? Can you see the value in bringing these groups together and align on a data strategy? How they can help you develop that trust framework. This is an approach we've used to create alignment with a variety of different clients up and down the management hierarchy. And quite frankly, we learn a lot from this experience as well, because again, we're there to just facilitate. We're helping them get those roadmaps initiated, but also at the strategic level, looking at this from a higher level of creating a safe data strategy. Michelle Arnaud, head of real-world data assets at IQVIA, says, working from a strategic standpoint and drilling down into our real business objectives allowed us to see where we needed to go. We could see a path forward so that we could dedicate effort to getting the job done. She's basically learned how important it is and valuable to align on safe data strategy with their organizational goals so that the core business objectives are being met, right? It's about enabling, innovating, using data in a responsible way. Okay, the third core step to developing a safe data strategy is our framework for principles of trusted system design. These are the rules of action. Now, we're talking about the full life cycle of data: collection, processing, storage, destruction, right? And we're going to look at it within the operational context to meet those organizational goals, right? Acme already had many systems in place. Part of this exercise was also understanding how they could reorganize or retrofit existing technology where there are potentially gaps. And the same approach is being applied here, right? They need to figure out where people are comfortable and how they can, enhance that. So once defined in terms of these frameworks and these principles, then we have a strong foundation to consider how to embed safe data practices into the engineering realm, right? So first, let's ask, whose trust are we trying to gain? Which groups do you need to convince and to get aligned and working with you on your strategy? Who needs to trust your system? Who needs assurance that data is safe? Now, we can break this down into three general groups: the organization, system, and individuals. So at Acme Analytics, the organization, they already had an engaged team. That's what they were doing. They were bringing this team together to really, and this was a team of decision makers already. So they already had engagement at a very high level. But there's more to that as well. You got to consider perspectives from regulators. In the case of Acme Analytics, they did have certain individuals that had experience working with regulators. And so they could get some feedback in terms of their experience based on their business line, the type of data they collected, and the type of pipeline that they had in place. Next, the system. Of course, there are going to be functional groups that are going to be using this system. And so, of course, we're speaking to the data owner in many cases that, as we saw previously, they're concerned with the controls that are in place, right? They're not just going to take their data and put it into this new platform, for example, unless there's certain comfort with that because they've had that experience with the regulator, for example, or perhaps other considerations as well. But of course, there's also interoperability with other systems. If you're going to be telling people you're going to, here's a safe environment, a safe system in which they can use data, well, let's make sure that it doesn't have any unintended consequences in interacting with other systems. That's going to have to be pulled out as well. And then, of course, in terms of individuals, we have those users within those functional groups, not just the data owners, but the people working with the data. The data subjects as well. This is a perspective that we have to pull in, of course. We're talking about sensitive data, as well as any potential external users that could raise concerns, right? So we're not going to go into a full deep dive in each of these at this point. You might do that for a roadmap, but at a strategic level, you just need to be aware of these different perspectives and kind of see what are the core pieces that you need in order to have this conversation and make sure you have the right people at the table to discuss these. Again, we're trying to create alignment. We're trying to figure out what the design options are. And we also have to try and understand the risk appetite, how far we can go in any one direction, how far do we have to address different concerns. And your stakeholders will help you assess this risk appetite based on their experience. As I mentioned before, Acme Analytics had many in this case, many stakeholders, although they started with one business unit to test it out. So the system objectives factored into the engineering process we're referring to for trusted system design are predictable, or I'll call it predictable, manageable, and disassociated, and I'll explain those in turn. So think of this at a very general level here. So predictable is a system that does what people expect, okay? Both internal and external stakeholders. Manageable, a system that has adjustable controls in place, so it can meet a variety of different needs. So the data owner, for example, wants to know what controls they have and how they're going to know that everything's working. And then disassociated, so how individuals in the data can be hidden. And this will be dependent on the operational context, okay? So I presented this at a very high level. And you can kind of think, how would you frame the systems in your organization, right? Using these as just basic system objectives, high-level principles of what you're trying to achieve, right? Can you see how these could potentially earn the trust of the various stakeholder groups? So for example, in the case of Acme Analytics, they were asking questions around user experience, how it would guide them to make the right decision. So they knew that the people using the data would, they would know where the boundaries were, how it would prevent them from making inadvertent mistakes. And one of the core things that they found they needed in this particular business line was usage reports on various governance mechanisms. They needed to know that once they put data in place in a system, that they would know who's accessing it, how it's being accessed. They wanted basically sort of a rough audit log, high level, so they could just monitor to make sure that no one's using it that shouldn't, and how they're using it as well. So the point here is that we're framing trust to see the forest for the trees, right? We want to speak to a variety of different stakeholder groups in these broad terms. And here's the interesting bit. These system objectives were actually proposed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology to address privacy concerns. If you're familiar with some of the security objectives, it's very similar, right? You have this trifecta of three things, but they speak specifically to privacy and the building of trustworthy systems. So now having revealed that, there's actually many features. We can look at the fair information practice principles and see how, for example, these are some of the things that you would find in there. So look at, a predictable system. You've got purpose, specification, use, etc. So let's focus more specifically on Acme. Right? Predictable for them meant that for analytical purposes only, perhaps only the data outputs can be extracted from that system, right? They don't want people to extract raw data, just some statistical analyses. What sort of controls they had in place, data owner reports I mentioned in the previous slide. And disassociated, so the level of identifiability needed. For their particular cases, they didn't actually need highly identified, they didn't need a person's name, for example. Right? They just needed something to do their analytical analysis. So this comes into it as well, and this is where you start talking about the operational context in which this is happening. And this is ultimately a system engineering approach to building trust. So each of these system objectives contribute to enhancing trust, but it's not all or nothing, right? It's not like you have to have all three of these to the maximum, right? Again, we want to have options, and we do. Acme, for Acme, it was about making sure that safe data aligned with their business objectives, right? And this is going to be driven by the use cases that they had. And as I said, they started with one business line to tease out what the wants and needs were for at least them. And the goal here is to demonstrate a desired level of trustworthiness, right? What do we need in terms of features, descriptions, reports, etc., to really show how a system maintains trust? But of course, the system itself is going to reinforce trust through that technology-enabled governance, certain things that will be captured there. Acme was really focused on areas that will make strategy real for their stakeholders. So, of course, we're talking about this at a strategic level, so we're not going to go any deeper, but they did eventually start looking at roadmaps as well. But the core of this was they were looking at their team and they wanted to be evidence-driven, okay? They wanted to know what worked in the past, what didn't, what sort of challenges they faced, what others in the industry do, what's best practice, for example. So this is at a strategic level. We're trying to align this idea of design and implementation to the concept of trust, right? We want to know what capabilities are already in place. We want to reorganize or streamline or automate or add extra features, right? Depending on what the needs are. Leroy Ruggiero, business technology leader at J&J, says, approaching privacy from a system design perspective feels perfectly natural to our engineering team. It's allowed us to align senior leadership with technologists and bring privacy into the domain of compliant platform and system design. It's an approach that helped them develop core capabilities that can be used to meet a variety of data privacy and governance requirements. So now we're at the +1, the execution on safe data strategy. So the purpose of creating a safe data strategy, I think I mentioned this earlier on, is to more effectively use or reuse data to achieve those organizational objectives, right? We're incorporating safe data at the core of this in order to create alignment with all those different stakeholders and drive execution. So is your organization using trust strategically? Do you think they're using it to build alignment with stakeholders? Is data processing framed in such a way that you can understand how trust can be earned from the system so that everyone can see the forest from the trees? What could they do better? So we've seen this slide already when we describe what we meant by a safe data strategy and the value that it can bring to an organization, right? We're reframing a data strategy through this exploration of trust and system design so that you're going to get acceptance on the vision that will inspire your data strategy, and you're going to have a desire from those stakeholders to see the vision realized. You want to get those key decision makers on board with what you're trying to achieve. They're going to row the boat with you. Acme included a data access model in the end as part of their framework to further consolidate their vision and goals. But I mean, that's where we start getting into more of the next step, the execution step, right? The point is that we're ready to evaluate that operational context once we've aligned on all of these to look at developing the roadmaps with measurable objectives. And we can factor in those technical details, but of course, at this point, you're going into really very specifics of an organization and what, to understand what those objectives should be for them based on probably a subject of another conversation or another presentation, because that would go a little bit over time. So, okay. Giving you a lot to think about with this presentation. Hopefully, we've used this approach across a variety of projects, not just Acme Analytics, but it provides sort of, we get specific questions. Hopefully, it provides you with sort of a view of what those are. In terms of the approach that we've used, we get specific technical questions regarding strategic solution design to broad enterprise-wide changes. The point is that we use this and it works. It gets people aligned. It gets people to the next step where we can help them with their roadmaps. It's a big topic, as I said. What we're going to do now, though, is before we go into a Q&A, because I want to make sure we have time for that, we're just going to ask you a couple polling questions. So I will ask Robert now to launch one of the polls. The first one is going to be, I'm just going to move this here so I can read it properly. So could you or your organization drive more value from sensitive data if that data could be used more often by more people for different projects? Now, I'm hoping Robert's
we've just launched that poll, so we'll just give a couple of folks a couple of seconds to enter in their responses, and it is an overwhelming majority are yes, but we're just getting some final updates. I'm assuming that you would probably hope to hear from that. But what I'll do is, I think everyone's pretty much given their answers. I'm going to close this poll, and then I'm going to present it. So stand by for the reveal. So that poll is closed, and there are the results of this first poll. Is that what you were expecting to see, Luke?
I actually don't see it myself.
Okay. Well, so let me just, if you can't see it, I'll read out the stats. Okay, it's 89% were yes, 0% for no, and 11% for maybe on that. Okay, great.
Yeah, that's kind of what I expected. Although it does depend on the audience and where they're sitting in the organization. But that is good to see. That is very interesting. So now we'll move on to the next. I'm assuming you can still see my slide.
Well, what I've done is just gone ahead and launched the second.
Oh, great.
So
should I just read it out then?
Please do. Yeah.
Okay, sure. So do concerns around the uses of sensitive data limit your or your organization's ability to easily share data internally or externally? Now, of course, if you're not in a position where you're maybe seeing this, I mean, the idea is to get your perspective at the organizational level as well.
And again, we are having people vote, and I'm just looking to see. So we've got people still voting. We're still getting the results in, but it looks again overwhelmingly for one particular status. So let me just ask people, if you haven't voted, we're going to close this poll now. So let me just go ahead and close that poll and share that. So just Luke, just for your information, we had received 100% yes for this second poll. So that was that one. And then I will just go ahead and launch the third one. If you want to read the third one out, it's up and running, so people can then go ahead and enter their poll for the third quick poll. So this is the last poll. So if you want to just read that out, that would be good.
For sure. So how aware do you believe senior leadership is of the importance of alignment on the uses of sensitive data? So of course, in our experience, obviously, I'm very pleased to see those results in a sense. I mean, obviously there should be some concerns. It's not unexpected. But then the question is, do people understand at a senior level how to align? And depending on where you sit within an organization, you might have a very different view of this. But it'd be interesting to see. I'm very curious to see the results of this one in particular, because this is where we're often working. We're often working with the senior leadership to kind of help them pull this together so that people can understand the history of many of the decisions that have been made. And in many cases, people aren't aware that a lot of the history has actually led them to a certain way and culture of doing things where they actually have some of the controls or many of the controls in place. It's just not always well known across the organization.
And Luke, thanks for that. It's stable and everyone has cast their votes. So let me close that and then just share that on the screen and read out the options. So we had, how aware do you believe senior leadership is of the importance of alignment of the users of sensitive data? We had 11% said very aware, 78% said somewhat aware, and 11% said not aware. And 0% said, I don't know.
Interesting. Excellent. Well, with that, then we're getting short on time. So how about we bring Mike back in and we can kick off the Q&A.
So, Mike.
Thank you.
And Luke, thank you very much indeed. I appreciate that. I'll just see if I can go back to your presentation. Luke, just make sure that we have your screen up. So just give me a minute. Make you you are presenter. So can you? I'm just not sure we're seeing your screen. But Mike, do you want to come off, Mike, and maybe see if there's any kind of questions? What we would like to do is, if you have got questions, you can use the question box below, and we will do our best to answer them. So, Mike, do you want to see what questions are out there so far?
Yeah, I do. I just want to say thanks to Luke on that. I thought it was very interesting and stimulating. Made me think a lot about how the use of the language could lead different people into different interpretations. For instance, what is a safe data strategy as opposed to a safe data strategy? You know, and what that might mean to different people. Yeah. It's the nuances that sit behind all of this that are really, really important. Quite recently, I had a hospital querying me about data privacy issues and asking, they were going to buy some new ventilators from Philips, you know, very, very of the moment. And they were concerned about having to share patient data to buy them. And I thought, well, you know, why on earth would you do that in the first place? Because you didn't do that outside of the COVID pandemic. So why would you do that now? And what if Philips care who the initial patient might be? I mean, people just getting that, you know, we're going to buy a ventilator for person X. Do we need to tell the company about that? Well, it's, you know, that's crying out for a visit from Privacy Analytics, frankly. So,
well, I will say that you're right about the nuances in the language, and that was intentional in the end. We almost put a hyphen in, but it works both ways. It's safe data and safe strategy. They both work into the presentation.
Oh yeah. No, I get that. So one of the first questions that come in is how does this approach that you're sort of putting forward address the lack of data literacy, and your poll has gone to that, you know, the lack of data literacy at the top echelons. You know, how do you address that lack either by echelons or across the whole business?
It's good, great question, and I did set myself up with that one by mentioning it, I think, twice in the presentation. So there are a couple different factors. One is, notice that in this approach, when we're interviewing different stakeholders and bringing people together, senior leaders, if possible, to actually, represent those different groups, the compliance, the IT, and the business line, we're bringing those people together. That's step one, right? We're getting them to talk to one another. So if you have a good engaged team, there's no ego, right? They're there to explain and to understand one another. And that's one of the things you do as a facilitator, is you make sure that everyone is there to help. And we work with great organizations that where this, there's nothing for us to do. We just lead the conversation, but it's about getting them to speak, because the compliance person has a perspective based on their experience. But when they hear what the data uses are, like the example you just mentioned, Mike, there may be very legitimate reasons. I don't know. I can't say off the top of my head. But of course, you pointed out there are questions that are raised, like, well, wait, why do you need that person's information? And that's a good conversation to have. So that right there, you're addressing data literacy indirectly by getting people to talk to one another, someone who understands data versus someone who doesn't. And then you're being asked to answer questions and explain to that, for example, compliance person, what does this mean? And that's really important. You need people that are willing to explain the technology, explain the uses of data in a way that everyone can understand. Because once you start to see and you hear those questions, I find, at least in giving presentations, doing a lot of educational work, those questions help me refine my messaging. I understand then, oh, I didn't explain a certain thing well enough, and I can do it differently next time. So that alone can start to increase data literacy, but also it's getting those people together, working together. Another aspect is we're moving the conversation a little bit. It's not just about talking about your data strategy in terms of the specific analytical things you want to do. Some of it is about making sure that trust is part of that fabric, right? Wrapping that around the overall data strategy. And now people who are maybe not as data literate, at least they understand conceptually some of these core objectives, these trustworthy systems design, where they do, they can look at policies and see if it aligns and have those conversations. And that as well is going to move the conversation a little bit. So it's not going to, not everyone's going to be a statistician after this, but they'll have more understanding of one another's perspectives.
Yeah. So if I do have a question that's just whizzed up from the audience. Is, will you be prepared to share the slide pack so that we've recorded this and people can come back to it as often as they like? But would you be prepared to share the slide pack after this?
I'll have to check. I'm not sure. Not sure what the thing is, but we'll have, as you said, the full presentation will be available.
Okay, sure. So if I just develop that question, you could see how approaching the data strategy and the safe data strategy would be great for new projects, because you've probably got a new team, people looking at new ideas. But how do you sort of come in and lay, put down this idea of a safe data strategy or safe data and privacy with legacy systems, some of which will have been working for years and which, have been producing the goods for the company and which may need to change?
Yeah, that's a great example. So I'll go back to Acme Analytics, right? They had many business lines as established multinational company. And they did have, exactly. They had some new initiatives, some new things that they were focusing on. They did a few things. First of all, they decided to pick one business line to start looking at this because they were developing a new platform and they wanted to move data to that. But of course, you're right. They had many things already established, and that's fine. That's part of the process. The question is, how did they get there? Like, you have these conversations, you find out, oh, there's, maybe there's certain aspects that are, not as accurate or a little bit noisy, and you realize, oh, that was intentional. And you would never know that until you start having these conversations with people and, speaking, trying to understand how this fits within these safe, trusted systems principles. And you realize, oh, that was actually intentional. So there was certain uncertainty in terms of, say, identifiability, for example. So there's things that you learn about why those legacy systems ended up where they are, right? There's history there when we want to capture that, because in many cases, some aspects of this people are already doing, right? What we're presenting is sort of a higher level strategic view, so you can pull it together and everyone can start to see how that historically the systems came together. But of course, you're also going to find, some of these legacy systems maybe don't meet the current needs, but whether it be for a specific data use, data owners' concerns, regulatory, et cetera. And that's what you're trying to do with this process is pull these all together so you can actually look at these in a more systematic way.
Cool, brilliant. So we get the idea of safe, and safe is probably a relatively absolute term in all of this? And does it fit within the regulatory requirements? Is it safe from damaging other systems, other bits of data that it's brought into it? But how then, and this is a particular bugbear of mine, how do you sort of combine the idea of safe with the ethics of the data, of how you're intending to use the data and which data you choose to use for a particular purpose within this whole safe data strategy?
Oh, that's a great question. So first of all, I'll say that anyone who's worked in compliance or has been involved with compliance will know that it's not a checkbox exercise. So it's not a yes, this is safe, yes or no, because we work with a lot of different organizations in many jurisdictions, and they have different interpretations, different cultures, things that they are willing to do. Again, even from a risk-based perspective, you could see how they could focus one area or another depending on both their risk appetite, their experience, and where they're at. So it's not always we're at the safe level, but we do incorporate in this concept the idea of ethics. It's a very important one, especially nowadays. I've been in the healthcare field for over a decade now, and that's where I started. So ethics, right off the bat, you have to take an ethics course. It's the first thing you do. And back then, when I worked at a hospital, that was clear. And when we used to talk to companies and say, talk about ethics, at the time, a decade ago, this was unheard of. Like, people said, no, that's what you do at a research hospital. We get that, but that doesn't apply to corporate enterprise. But that's no longer the case. I think it's pretty well understood now, especially with the developments in deep learning and AI, that people recognize that there is an ethical piece to this, and we're having impact on people's lives when we're using this data. And so we have to, take that into consideration. And so we do, we don't dictate to companies, but we do advise them. And we'll show them some of what's going on. And many, like Acme Analytics, right? They've established an AI ML ethics committee, and they have a certain way of doing this. And this is part of that. This is part of, I think, the maturity of all organizations that are really recognizing that there are a lot of concerns, both from regulators, but also from their users, from the general public, right? And so we're seeing this more and more, and we do factor that into, consideration of what people consider to be safe.
Super. So I think we're almost out of time, and we've got, I think, time just for one quick question. Now, the definitions that sit around safe data and its ability to be used, the ethics that sit around that, who owns that in the company, for instance?
Right, that's a good question. So it comes down to ownership. So who has sort of the final say? So it depends on the organization, right? And in this case, we're talking about, for example, in the case of Acme Analytics, a data leader, someone who's already senior in the organization that came in and wanted to do this, wanted to enact this. And so it wasn't one person that owned it. It was actually several. But in order for this to move forward, it was recognized that they had to agree as a group. So you obviously had to, have the business people aligned. You had to have the compliance group aligned. You had to have IT supporting all of that as well. Sometimes you'll have, for example, a chief data officer, and they may own this as well. But of course, they're not doing it alone. So that's why I'm being a little bit cagey here. It's that it's not a single function, but it could be, in the end of the day, the chief data officer that actually takes responsibility and says, look, this is something I understand that we need. We need trusted systems. We need people that will want to see us use data in a responsible way. So that becomes part of their sort of mandate. That becomes something they take ownership of. We've seen this. We've seen this many times as well.
Brilliant. I sort of agree with that. I think, your data leader, your CDO, perhaps is taking the leadership role within this, whereas ownership could be split amongst various parts of the organization, because they're the people who have the operational control over the data and are the data owners, for want of a better term. Anyway,
exactly.
So Luke, brilliant, very engaging. I've thoroughly enjoyed that, and my writing hand is now worn out from scribbling notes as we went along. So I think a very worthwhile presentation. I think you've set the fires going under a lot of thoughts there. So I hope that everybody that's attended has got something out of that. I'd like to thank you on behalf of the International Society of Chief Data Officers for the time that you've taken in preparing this and in giving this. and I can only say that it's going to be one of the webinars that I go back to in a couple of months, just to give me a check on the tiller when I need to on this particular subject. Robert, over to you now to close down.
Yep, Mike, thanks very much indeed. Luke, thanks very much indeed. Happy holidays to everyone on this webcast, and you'll all get a link to the recording as soon as we post it up on the website. So thank you, everyone, and stay safe and stay healthy. Appreciate it.
Thank you.